My name is Teresa Glazer. I was born in Warsaw and lived there for the first 7 years of my life. When the war started, we lived in a part of Warsaw, Żoliborz, where the bombing was quite heavy because nearby there was a railway station, Dworzec Gdański. On the other side, there was a bridge across the Vistula, and our courtyard was next to the citadel, which sort of held various military trophies and whatnot. So my father was in the army, and the bombing was quite heavy. So my father said to my mother, take the children. I had a younger brother, and my gran was visiting us. So he said, take the children. We had some relatives in eastern Poland, away from the bombing. So there was a special train provided for the evacuation of army families. And so my mother just packed a tiny suitcase, because when we were leaving, it was after the 3rd of September, after England and France declared war on Germany. So everybody expected the war to last only a very short time, Germany to lose, and we will come back. So my mother had to carry Andrzej, my brother. He was too small to sort of walk with us. And my granny was there. We boarded the train, and only a few kilometers outside Warsaw, some German planes came. They bombarded it. The train stopped, and everybody sort of got out, and they were hiding in ditches and whatnot. But anyway, the train was bombed badly, so we couldn't go any further. So then my mother hired a horse and cart somehow. We all got on to it, and I remember that these German planes, we thought that they might try to do us harm if they were coming from some important mission, some military mission or something. But no, there were lots of people. The roads were packed. People were coming with all their belongings, carrying furniture, God knows what. And I recently listened to a radio program when they said that in Belgium they did the same, that it wasn't just army sort of objects which were sort of important to the war, but they deliberately wanted to confuse the population, to frighten people, so that they deliberately sort of lowered down, and they were shooting at us. And when the plane appeared on the horizon, my mother would tell the men to stop and get us down into a ditch, and she put our heads, one arm, Andrew's here, mine there, and she said, if we get killed, let it be together. But my grandmother wouldn't come down. She had a very old-fashioned coiffure, sort of high up here, and she had some black stole. And when the plane came, she was waving her umbrella and muttering some curses on them. I remember looking up. There was a beautiful, very blue sky. It was September, had good weather, and there was the silhouette of my granny. And we traveled through one place. Both sides of the road were in flame. Everything was in flame. Another one was very, very quiet, and there wasn't anything moving. There were just lots of corpses, people's and horses' corpses decaying. So it really was. When we got to these friends in the East, very soon, on the 17th of September, the Russians marched in. So we said, you know, whether to be occupied by the Germans or the Russians, it's the same. At least, you know, we'll be in our own home, so we want to go back. But by that time, the Russians and the Germans divided Poland, and there was well, it was like a border, so you couldn't just cross it. I mean, some young men probably could, but not my mother with a small child, elderly mother, grandmother. And so you had to go to an office and get permission to cross to the German side, which my mother did. And it turned out, after talking to other friends, it turned out that this gave them, the Russians, because, well, they just occupied these territories, they didn't know people, this gave them a list of people who came from other parts of Poland and wanted to go back to their own city. This gave them a list so that on the night, there'd already been 2 deportations. Ours was the 3rd. And they collected everybody who didn't live in eastern Poland, in the borderlands. So they already had a list, because these people went to get permission to cross to. So our train was made up of people from other parts of Poland, not the borderland. And there were lots of Jews who, at the start of the war, were running away from Hitler and went voluntarily to Russia. But when they saw it was like that, they quickly got back. So the Russians picked them all up. And we had this, they put us in cattle wagons, and took about 3 weeks before we got to our destination. It stopped in a town called Teguldet, which was the last place which had a railway line. And then they took us by boat to some huge woods, huge forests. Someone said that these forests were 3 times as big as the area of Poland. There were no wires or anything. And all the people were employed falling trees. Well, as children, we were supposed to go to school, but I only went for about 3 days because my mom asked me what did we do, and the first 2 days they told us biographies of Karl Marx and Lenin and Stalin. But then they started asking if any of the parents were sort of naive enough to have holy pictures or icons. In Russia it's called ikona. And one girl put her hand up and said that they've got this case where her mother keeps her best tablecloths and so on. And at the bottom there is, because she saw it once. Because during the autumn we could collect mushrooms or berries, but in the winter all you had was a small portion of clay-like bread. Oh, it smelled so beautiful. And my grandmother used to say, oh, I can't eat it, it's so rough, because she could see that my brother was always hungry, so she gave. And she died, and we had to leave her in.
When you came to Valivade, did you know that a country like India existed?
It was the the British authorities who looked after us when we came out of Russia. And after the temporary places in few months in Tehran, in Ahvaz, then near Karachi, they had to find more permanent camps, and the British authorities asked all the Commonwealth countries, Canada, South Africa, and India. And apparently the Indian government was the first who agreed. But they said that the Indian government, the Indians, are not going to pay a penny towards our upkeep. So the Polish government, which was in London during the war, used to borrow money from the British government on the strength of Polish gold, which they managed to smuggle out of Poland before it was occupied by the Germans. So that it was Polish government which paid for our upkeep and so on. We came to Valivade in 1943, so I was 12 years old, and I was still at school, primary school. I attended the 5th and 6th grade of primary school and just started the first year of my secondary school. We had Polish schools in Valivade. It was like a little Polish town. Polish administration, church, schools, everything. I went to Valivade with my mother and my 7-year-old brother, and we lived in a barrack which was at the end of area. Valivade was divided into 5 sort of districts, and it was right next to the cinema. And we had a cinema built, and American films were shown, and the Indian people used to come to see people kissing, because apparently at that time Indian films you were not allowed to kiss. And my brother struck a friendship with the projectionist. Somehow the little hut with the projection equipment was separate from the place where people actually saw the film on a screen. I don't know how it worked. Anyway, my brother, and one day he came up to my mother and he said, Mom, when will you buy me a wife? So my mother said, what? We don't buy. Oh, because she said, Sanjay had a wife, but she's already 23, so he's buying a younger wife. And I haven't even got one. So my mother said, no, you have to grow up first. than you. Anyway, we all grew something. The barracks were surrounded by verandas, and we used to grow climbing plants and bananas, so it was nice and
So
green.
Vanda, when you look, I know it's a long time back, but when you look back at your coming to Valivade,
Yeah.
what are the feelings of seeing India after a long journey and a difficult life at Siberia? What feelings were there within you
Yeah, well,
because
we already, when we came out of Russia, we first stayed in Tehran, then Ahvaz, then country club near Karachi. We did not stay, it was the people on the way to Balachadi who stayed in Quetta. No, we stayed in country club where we lived in tents, and we already sort of, felt good because we were free after leaving Russia, but it was all communal life. In country club we lived in under tents. There were several tents joined together, and the sides didn't touch the ground, so that it'll be airy. But that way, we had sort of animals crossing there and so on. Then in Ahvaz, we lived in stables. I think we were told Maharajas, but Ahvaz is still in Persia, I think. Anyway, it was some prince's stables.
Yeah, that is not there. So, did you, when you came to Valivade, when you first came, what would,
Well,
and you started living for some time?
Yeah, the thing was that in Valivade, we actually had our own place, 2 rooms and a tiny kitchenette. Even though there were no windows, there was no ceiling, we could sort of lock the door and it was ours. For the first time, we sort of felt like a proper family, human beings, even though there were just rafters, and in every flat there was a huge wooden table. We just wondered why it was until the monsoon came. Then we realized because there was no ceiling, just rafters and loose tiles on top. With high winds, they would come tumbling down. So we used to sit under this big table, do our homework, eat our meals during the very bad monsoon time. We were still at school, and I remember that in this flat there was a bedroom with 3 beds, and we had mosquito nets. Now, the mosquito nets were not just protecting us from mosquitoes, but because there was no ceiling, just these rafters, there were things sort of dropping down like sort of scorpions. And you had to look in your shoe to see if there's a scorpion, maybe lizards and so on. So when you walk up, you just went like that to get rid of anything.
What kind of you were studying? The elder children were doing some work. Were there workshops, as I read in your book, Holes in India? So what was your mother doing? I mean, your mother was working there?
No, my mother, she did work when we were in the country club in Karachi, but in Valivade she didn't. She was just a housewife. The poor housewives had a tiny little ring kitchenette, and they did marvels. They used to cook meals and bake cakes on it. Also, the ingredients that they could buy were different from the ones that they were used to. Well, first of all, there was no meat. There was only, because beef was not obtainable, of course there was no pork.
There was mutton.
There was mutton, and I think koza. What's koza?
Okay. Kid.
goat.
Goat. Yeah. Mother.
Yeah, and there were no apples. There was a variety of fruit, lovely mangoes and bananas, but not the fruit we were used to, like no potatoes, first of all, and no apples.
So where was your father?
Oh, my father was in the army. He was fighting in, there was a Polish army under British command, and it was General Anders Corps. They fought, first of all, they were in Palestine, then they were fighting in Italy, Monte Cassino, and so on. Indian troops were there as well. Our friend Colonel Gaikot was also fighting there at a different time from the Polish troops. So children, I was first in a primary school, then I went to secondary school. And the secondary school took people right up to matriculation. There were, I don't know, over 2,000 children. There was also an orphanage, like the one in Barachadi. The Indians who brought flowers to the camp would just pluck the heads, and we try to persuade them that we want the stalks as well, not just because they would just pluck the heads. And everyone had to have the mister who fetched water, because we had no running water. So it was like in the Stone Age. They carried 2 buckets on. I can't
On their
remember.
back.
Yeah, and
They're called history.
during some special holidays, the our mister would sit my mother on a chair and put a garland of flowers around her. And he had a little boy. When my brother grew out of some clothes, and this boy used to run about just stark naked. My mother gave him some clothes, and he came to demonstrate what he looked like in these clothes. But only once, later on, I don't know what he did with the clothes, but later on he carried on. The local Indians brought everything to the camp. There were stalls with fruit, later on with meat. Also some Polish chaps opened shops selling Polish sausage and so on. They brought flowers, fruit, and because ours was the last barrack, and then there was the cinema, some of the Indians who worked in the camp lived there, so it was like very, very primitive. There was just a stick, some cover, and the women used to grind. There was a crop called jugara. I don't know whether it's kind of corn or what it was. Now, also because we had no ceiling, no floor, the women used to come and spread a mixture of cow dung and clay. And the Indian girls, young women, used to walk along the streets between our barracks and advocate there. Some Polish people taught them a rather rude word for this, so they would go around shouting, fresh sheet, good sheet, pomazacze. Also ice cream, because it was so hot. They would sort of say krakowskie lody, warszawska lemoniada, taka zimna. The strange thing is that for the 5 years that we lived there, we managed to cooperate very well with the Indian population. Say the postmaster even learned to speak really good Polish, because the Indians picked up words in Polish, because we had no common language. None of us spoke English. None of those people who had stalls and so on spoke English at all. So they learned to
So
speak.
were the Indian people working inside the camp?
Yes, there were lots of people. Like I told you, every family had to have someone carrying buckets of water. There were these people who had stalls. There were women who offered to do the washing. There was a river, Panchganga, nearby. So they would sort of thrash this washing against some stones and clean it that way. Yes, we had lots of people. The most exciting thing was scouting, camping, away from the camp. The first campings used to be in Panhala, which was belonged to the Maharaja. And later we camped on the edge of a real Indian jungle. And I remember all sorts of activities like shooting bows and arrows and getting various, in scouting there are all sorts of grades of getting sort of specific things if you want to be a nurse or whatever.
So scouting was one
We
of
had to get up ever so early, wash in cold water in the river, sort of get ready. I think these are the best memories of that time.
One is scouting. What is the other? Do you have any other memory which you...
Yes, I was very fond of reading. And my father, who was for a time in Palestine before they went to Italy, used to send me all in the army. They published Polish books which survived pre-war, stories, fiction stories, and I had so many. Some of my schoolmates liked to borrow them, so I had a little stamp. Własność Teresy Kurowskiej, belongs to Teresa. My maiden name was Kurowska. I put that stamp, and people, when I was still in a junior school, there were two rascals, two twins, and I fancied one of them. And it was very exciting when he walked me from school to exchange, borrow another book or something like that. It was all very innocent. As far as sort of boy-girl relationships, we would sort of, go for a walk, or I don't know, maybe some people went as far as kissing, but mostly not. They would just sort of parade with the girls would parade with their group of friends and the boys with theirs. And there was a wider street, main street, where in the evening people would parade and maybe exchange some remarks. We didn't know anything. We celebrated Indian independence, but we didn't know anything about the partition between India and Pakistan. But what we were, having gone through all the deprivation in Russia, we were we sort of felt poverty and we empathized with it. And I remember thinking what difference there was between, say, during, there was a coronation of a new Maharaja because they adopted a new one. And there was an elephant docked with, huge rubies, precious diamonds, and then there were these people living on the verge of starvation. And also another thing is that we sympathized with India wanting independence because our country was occupied. And the Indian people found it strange at first because the only Europeans they knew were the British, who treated them rather as sort of second-class citizens, and they couldn't understand that we didn't. One of our friends, Danka, told a story how they were traveling in a small bus to the seaside, and the driver kept stopping in villages because it was in 1947, just before independence. He would go meet with the people who were holding a meeting, and they said, "Can we go?" He said, "No, no, no, it's too dangerous for you." Then it went on for some time, and then he brought a couple of people with him because they wanted to go to the next village, and they were driving in silence, and one of them, a bolder one, sort of shouted, "British, go home!" And our people sort of seconded that. And the driver explained to them, although we are white Europeans, we are not the British, and our own country is not free, so we empathize with people. Very well. We received letters, and those women who had someone in the army, they would get some money as well. No, we were watching, avidly the events, what was happening. Then 1944 Warsaw Uprising, we knew what was happening. There was a radio in a common room, and there was a Polish paper printed in Bombay where they informed us about all the important events that was happening.
And about people also who were fighting war? I mean,
oh, yes.
Events is a different thing, but how did you find, I mean, when you went to Siberia, then your father, you knew where he was? You knew continuously?
No.
Because some people had lost.
In the south of Russia, a Polish army was formed under General Anders, and my father sort of joined the army, and General Anders was very keen for the families to come out as far as possible, because he knew the soldiers would fight better if they were sure that their families were all right. But the Russians allowed so many people, and then suddenly they stopped. They said no more. So I was actually one of the last transports which didn't cover through the sea, but across the mountains. So we were very lucky to get out of Russia.
So tell me the experience. You were there when you witnessed India's independence?
Yes, we celebrated Indian independence together with our Indian friends. Oh yes, we had some contacts with Indian scouts. So I think they came. It's described by people who remember more in our book, in the English version. Have you read it?
Yeah, I have read it, but I wanted you to say it. How do you remember celebration of India's independence in Valivade, Kolhapur? I just wanted you to relate it on camera. What do you remember of that day?
I just remember this sort of, holiday spirit. Then we all went to the hall where we used to see films. I can't remember anything specific, just a sort of, We certainly didn't want to go anywhere near any country. The German armies were defeated, but Russia, Czechoslovakia, Hungary were really occupied by the Russian armies. So we didn't want to. And some of the people who did go back had very bad experiences. They were either imprisoned or... So no, we came to England very reluctantly, because after India, 1947 was terribly, terribly cold. It was damp. There was no central heating anywhere. We didn't know the language. So, my compatriots come now sort of thinking England will offer them a better life. But at that time, we didn't like coming to England at all.
So how did you come back? Do you remember your mother, your brother?
We traveled because there was an act of parliament passed which gave the Polish soldiers the same rights as the British soldiers. So anyone who served, like my father, in a Polish army and the British, could bring their families. And we traveled by a boat called Empire Brent, and came to Passingworth, I think, a transit camp. It was very important because even though we were very aware of the war going on and we were hoping at the end of the war to go back to our own country, we friends at school, scouting, those 5 years really sort of founded friendships which have lasted to this day. That's why we have these reunions every 2 years. So even though the war was on, this gave us some sort of semblance of normal life and childhood, which was so, so suddenly interfered with when the war broke out. So we remember this period very, very as something very, very good, blessing. It's really just a friendly association. We don't have any big funds, just a subscription. And we just formed it because we wanted to meet friends we remembered. And we have these reunions every 2 years. Association of Poles in India was formed in the year 1990, but even before then, there were some reunions, first of the people from Balachadi, then there were 2 reunions, 1971 and 73, in London. And we just missed each other's company, and that's why we wanted. And the purpose of it is just mainly social. We published a book first in Polish, then in English, and there's a bulletin published twice a year which tells us, in the meantime, between the reunions, what's happening to our friends and so on, who has died. Lots of our friends this year have died. We are hankering after our youth, our sort of friendships, and well, it happened in Valivade in India, but yes, and especially that there was this terrible war which we all experienced around, and this gave us a safe sort of period of time where we could sort of be the children we were. I have been back to any of the trips. I want to remember Valivade as it was, because seeing it from pictures, it's so different that ourselves Indians usually. It's an association of Poles in India, 1942-48. After we managed to get away from Soviet Russia, where they deported us at the start of the war, where their former allies, the Germans, attacked them, we sort of became allies with the Russians. There was a Polish army from southern Russia. My father went into the army, and quite a lot of families managed to get out of Russia. The first port of call was Tehran. We crossed over to Persia. Then we stayed for a bit in Ahvaz, and eventually India, Valivade. We were very grateful that India offered us sort of safe refuge from war-torn Europe. And because this was the time where most of us were still at school, we sort of formed friendships from school, from scouting. They are so strong, the bonds that tie us, that it survived all the years. After the war, people went to different parts. Some went back to Poland. Well, we didn't want to go back to Poland, which was more or less occupied by the Russian armies. So we came to England. There was an act of parliament passed which gave those Polish soldiers who served in the Polish army and the British command the same rights as the British soldiers. They could bring their families. But we didn't know the language. After India, it was cold and miserable, so we didn't like it here at all. We were waiting throughout the war. They were telling us at school, work hard so that you can rebuild Poland after the war. Well, the war ended. There was no free Poland. It was England. But we all had to study, found families, and after we sort of established ourselves, we decided to form. There were sporadic meetings before then. By 1990, when quite a lot of us were retired, we decided to form a formal association. Its purpose is just purely social. We just have, our funds consist just of the membership fees, £8 a year. So we're not a rich association, and we decided to write a book of our experiences.